I am an idiot. No, maybe not an idiot. Dumb, at least. Or ignorant, I guess. But I'm getting dumber all the time, and it's really disconcerting to me. I can even track it back. I know when this all started, when I started going downhill. Because I remember when I reached my peak of intelligence. It was December of my freshman year in college. I had just finished the first semester and had all those 101 courses under my belt. I had just gotten back to Marlton to spend Christmas with my folks. And I was so pleased to inform them that I had figured the entire world out at that point. I knew exactly what was going on in the world so far beyond their conventional wisdom. And I was all too happy to explain to them why I was so much more advanced and so much more mature in my intellectual thought than they possibly could be. My parents sat there with just a smug look on their face and a smile as I continued on about how much my eyes had been opened to the wonders of the world, because they knew what would happen from that time forward. As college went, and after I graduated and traveled a little bit and lived outside of the country, I began to realize I wasn't as smart as I thought I was. And as I got answers to questions, I realized more questions would just pop up. The more places I went, the smaller I felt in the world. And it seems like every day, the more I learn, the more I realize I need to learn. I just keep getting dumber and dumber the more I go. Paul talks about intelligence when he's speaking to the people in Corinth in our first reading. He talks about how we can rely too much on our intelligence. It's not that Paul's saying we should be unintelligent or uninformed at all. What he's saying is, so often we get so full of ourselves and the intelligence that we have, the knowledge that we have, that we forget about the importance of God in our life. We start to pump ourselves up so much that we lose sight of God standing right before us. There's no better example of that than in the call of the disciples. The people that Jesus gathered around himself. The people that Jesus entrusted his church to. Now, you'd think that something that important, that Jesus would want the best and the brightest, the most capable, the strongest people to carry out this really important ministry and mission. But that's not what he did at all. You know, we don't have a lot of accounts of what the disciples were like before Jesus met them. But if you do a little bit of research and work backwards, you can figure some things out. A guy named Rob Bell is a great preacher, great theological mind. I saw him at the National Youth Gathering back in Atlanta a few years ago, and seen a few Bible studies of him since. And he had a great perspective as he did some historical research. You know, if you think back, all those disciples, all of those people that followed Jesus were good little Jewish boys and girls when they grew up. And like any Jewish boy and girl, they grew up going to Hebrew school, learning about the faith, learning the Torah, learning the Hebrew language. But there was a difference back in Jesus' time. Hebrew school was ultra-competitive. All right, so maybe that part's not different from nowadays with our kids in school. But the competition was more than just bragging rights. It was more than just pride. It was a competition over the future of your life. Because, see, what would happen is, as you reached your 13th birthday, and you were ready for your bar or bat mitzvah, when it was time for you to graduate from Hebrew school, if you were at the top of the class, if you were the best and the brightest, if you had the best grooming and the best potential, then a star rabbi would take you under his wing, and you would become his apprentice. And you would travel the world, you would get to continue your education, and eventually you'd be able to make a choice if you wanted to be a Pharisee or a Sadducee, to work in the church. Or you could be a Levite, a respected elder in the religious community. You could choose your own destiny. But if you weren't at the top of the class, if you had trouble with your Hebrew, or didn't memorize all of your Torah perfectly, if you weren't a prized pupil, if you weren't seen as being the best and the brightest, if you weren't that prodigy student, well then, your education was over when you turned 13. And that was the end of the road for you. And having no other prospects in the world, not expecting all that much from you, you'd go to work. And because you didn't have any prospects of your own, you'd go to work with your father. And you'd work with him until you turned about 18. And then you'd take over the family business and go off on your own. Now, thinking back to the last 2 weeks where we've had accounts of the disciples being called. When Jesus called them, what were they doing? They were fishing with their father, taking over the family business, because they got left behind as all the best and the brightest had moved on. They were the ones that were seen as losers, the ones that weren't smart enough, the ones that weren't groomed enough, the ones that weren't proper enough for the world to expect very much at all from them. Even more than that, they were still working with their fathers, so they weren't even 18 yet. We usually think of them as being adults and grown-ups and learned individuals, but most likely they were 16, 17-year-old dropouts that Jesus grabbed and brought to himself. Because he saw something in them that the world didn't. He saw an openness to God's message. He saw a strength that the rest of the world didn't see inside of them. And he chose that group of misfits, that group of losers, that group that the world expected nothing from, to base his church on, to pass his ministry onto. And that group did nothing less than change the world, because God flowed through them. Well, that call of the disciples is the same call that you and I hear today. It's a call to go out from our places of comfort. It's a call for us to go out and make a difference in this world, to serve those who are in need. It's a call for us to be called to action, to work together. And it's a call that we're trying to answer as a community in the next weeks and months. As I've said over the last couple of weeks, we're in the process of vision discernment now. We're trying to figure out what our values are, what we're all about, what's important to us. We're answering the question, who are we as Ascension Lutheran Church? And when we answer that question, it'll allow us to start to chart our course for what direction we think God is calling us to. And my first meeting with our vision discernment team, we have a group of 8 people that are going to help organize us so that we can start this process. And we started to plan out what we're going to do. And we're going to have probably some email surveys. We're going to have some paper surveys that we're going to pass out in worship. We're going to have some small group and large group meetings where people will be invited to offer their thoughts, their views on what the church is all about, what the church ought to be all about. All to answer that question of who are we. But I had a great, thoughtful comment that arose on Thursday night. One person said, "Pastor, I think this is all a good idea. I think it's great that we're going to put surveys out, that we're going to ask people what they think and invite them to participate. But the problem is we have 1,500 members here on the books at Ascension. And 50 people are going to answer you. And it's the same 50 people that always answer the surveys. It's the same 50 people that volunteer all the time. It's the same 50 people that we already know all about. And that doesn't help us at all." And they're exactly right. Because the problem is so often in the church, we have such a wonderful group of leaders that work really hard that we let them just take over. And let them just have all the word, have all the say. We trust that they're the best and the brightest. They're the ones who have been around for a while and know how to do it. They should be the ones to do all of this. And I know that those who are already involved in ministry here, those who are already involved in the life of the congregation, will definitely participate in that process. But I'm not talking to them right now. I'm talking to you. The person who comes here on Sunday morning and you worship and you love being here, but you don't feel like you should take another step in your ministry. I'm talking to the person who feels like they're too young or they're too old to be able to really contribute anything to our ministry. I'm talking to the person who sits there thinking, I don't really have anything worthwhile to share. I don't have any great insight or anything important. I'm talking to the person who's watching this on YouTube tomorrow, who isn't ready to take that step to sit with us on a Saturday night or a Sunday morning, or our friends on Facebook that we don't get to see as often. I'm talking to all of those who haven't been called to raise a voice or raise an opinion. Because God knows that you have something precious inside of you. God has perfectly suited you for ministry in this world. And we need each and every one of you to lend your voice to define who we are. Because it's not a church of one. It's not a church of 50. It's a church of all of God's people. All of us gathered together. You may not know it yet, but God has perfectly groomed you to a unique ministry in this world. God has given you a voice. God has given you a heart that you can lend for us to work together so that we can define who we are. We can define where we're going, what ministry we're going to do in the world. It's only if we have all of us, each and every one of you, to raise your voice and join together. It's only if we do that that we can go out from this place and change the world. Amen.